May 6, 2014, Union County Circuit Court, South Carolina. Everyone in this courtroom knows something is terribly wrong, deeply, disturbingly off. Because while family members weep in the gallery, while prosecutors detail a brutal double murder, two defendants are doing something that makes everyone's blood run cold. They're smiling, giggling even, exchanging longing glances across the courtroom like teenagers in love. At one point, they even pucker their lips, as if to blow kisses to each other. This isn't a wedding. This isn't a romantic comedy. This is a murder trial. And these two people, Jeremy Lee Moody and Christine Susan Moody, are about to be sentenced for one of the most cold-blooded, premeditated double murders South Carolina has seen in years. But here's where this story gets even more twisted, even more chilling, even more impossible to look away from. Because when the judge finally hands down their sentences, 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, do they break down? Do they show remorse? Do they plead for mercy? No. They lean across the courtroom barrier and share a long, passionate kiss. And then, as deputies escort them out of that courthouse, as the families of their victims watch in horror and disbelief, Jeremy and Christine Moody drop every single pretense of regret. The masks come off completely. And what emerges is something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Jeremy starts yelling first. He's shouting that the sentences are unfair, not because he's innocent, mind you, but because, in his twisted worldview, his victims deserve to die.
Child molesters do not deserve to live. They got exactly what they deserve. Had to do it over again, I'd kill more.
But it's Christine's words, caught by reporters as she's being placed into the back of a police car for transport to prison, that will haunt everyone who hears them. Her statement is so shocking, so devoid of humanity, that it almost doesn't seem real.
I think Jeremy and I would have done it again if given the opportunity.
Do you have any regrets?
I have no regrets. Killing that pedophile was the best day of my life.
What about not being able to see Jeremy?
Jeremy and I have a love that will withstand this.
When a reporter presses her about the remorse she expressed just moments ago in the courtroom, when she read verses from Psalm 69 and begged God for forgiveness, Christine's response is as cold as ice.
What about what you said in court about repenting? Is that not true then?
No, it's not true. My lawyer made me say it.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, as if she hadn't already crossed every conceivable line of human decency, Christine Moody adds one final vicious curse. Speaking about the victims' families, people who just lost their loved ones to a senseless act of vigilante violence, she says,
Do you have anything to say to the victim's family?
May they die also.
Now I need you to understand something crucial here, because this isn't just a story about 2 disturbed individuals who committed murder. This is a story about delusion, about righteousness taken to its most extreme and dangerous conclusion, about what happens when people decide they have the right to be judge, jury, and executioner. This is a story about Jeremy Lee Moody, a 31-year-old man with skinhead tattooed on his throat and white power emblazoned across his bald head, who identified as a white supremacist and believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that God himself had given him a divine assignment to eliminate sex offenders from the face of the earth. And this is a story about Christine Susan Moody, his 37-year-old wife, who would later describe their relationship as a fairy tale love like nothing anyone has experienced, even as she admitted to slitting another woman's throat with her own hands. The date was July 21st, 2013. The place was Jonesville, South Carolina, a small, quiet community where people knew their neighbors, where crime was relatively rare, where nothing like what was about to happen had ever happened before. The targets were Charles Marvin Parker, known to friends as Butch, a 59-year-old registered sex offender who had previously been convicted of sexually assaulting a disabled woman and had already served his sentence, and his wife Gretchen Dawn Parker, age 51, a woman whose only crime was being married to the wrong man at the wrong time. The Moodys had done their homework. They knew exactly where the Parkers lived. They knew Charles's history. They knew what they were going to do. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was premeditated, calculated, cold-blooded murder, planned and executed with chilling precision. The Moody's pulled up to the Parkers' home that summer day with their plan already in motion. They needed to get inside the house, needed to get close to their targets, and they had devised a simple but effective ruse to make it happen. They popped the hood of their car, staging what appeared to be engine trouble, the universal signal of a stranded motorist in need of assistance. And Charles Parker, being the kind of neighbor who would help someone in distress, emerged from his home to offer aid. It was an act of basic human kindness that would cost him everything. Because the moment Charles Parker stepped outside, Jeremy Moody pulled a gun. Just like that, the trap was sprung. Jeremy forced Charles back inside the house at gunpoint, and what happened next was a nightmare of violence that would shock even hardened investigators. Inside that house, Jeremy Moody became an executioner. He shot Charles Parker multiple times, the gunshots ringing out in what should have been a peaceful summer afternoon. But the horror didn't end there. It was only beginning. Because Christine Moody wasn't just an accomplice standing by while her husband committed murder. She was an active, willing participant in the carnage. She grabbed a knife and began stabbing both victims repeatedly, her blade rising and falling again and again. And when she came to Gretchen Parker, a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong, who was simply in her own home with her husband, Christine slit her throat. Let me say that again so the full weight of it lands. Christine Moody personally slit Gretchen Parker's throat, ending the life of an innocent woman who was, in Christine's own later words, merely a casualty of war. When family members arrived later that day and discovered the bodies, the scene was beyond comprehension. The autopsies would later confirm what investigators already knew from the brutality of the crime scene. Charles Parker had died from multiple gunshot wounds, while Gretchen Parker had died from the stabbings and the fatal wound to her throat. The attack had been prolonged, vicious, and utterly merciless. These weren't quick deaths. These weren't clean executions. This was rage and hatred made manifest in the most violent way imaginable. But here's what makes this case even more terrifying. The Parkers weren't going to be the Moody's only victims. When Jeremy and Christine were arrested just 3 days later on July 24, 2013, picked up after tips came in, and their own incriminating statements led police right to them, Jeremy did something that sent chills down the spines of every investigator in the room. He provided police with a hit list. On that list was the name and address of another registered sex offender, someone the Moody's had planned to kill the very next day. They weren't done. They were just getting started. In their twisted minds, they had embarked on a holy crusade, a divine mission to rid the world of sex offenders, one murder at a time. During their interrogations, the Moody's confessed to everything. They led investigators to the murder weapon, the handgun Jeremy had used to shoot Charles Parker. They led them to the knife Christine had used in the stabbings. They didn't hide what they'd done. They didn't minimize it or make excuses. If anything, they seemed almost proud of it. Jeremy told police officers, his voice filled with conviction, that God had instructed him to kill sex offenders. This wasn't Jeremy's idea, in his mind. This was divine will. This was a sacred duty. He was simply a servant carrying out the commands of a higher power. The fact that this higher power was actually the product of his own untreated schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, the fact that he'd been off his psychotropic medications at the time of the murders, didn't matter to Jeremy. In his delusional state, he genuinely believed he was on a messianic mission, that he had been chosen by God himself to cleanse the world of evil. Christine's motivations were different but no less disturbing. Her defense attorneys would later reveal that she had been sexually abused starting at the horrifying age of 2 years old. That abuse had continued throughout her childhood and had included rape by a convicted pedophile, a monster who, after serving only 18 months in prison, had actually stalked her after his release. 18 months. For destroying a child's innocence, for traumatizing her in ways that would echo through her entire life. This man served barely more than a year. Is it any wonder that Christine Moody harbored a rage so deep, so all-consuming, that it eventually found its outlet in murder? Her attorneys would paint a picture of a woman who had been failed by the justice system, who had watched her abuser walk free, who had every reason to believe that sex offenders didn't pay a high enough price for their crimes. But here's the thing about vigilante justice that makes it so dangerous, so corrosive to the very fabric of society. It doesn't care about innocence or guilt in any legal sense. It doesn't care about due process or proportionality or rehabilitation. It only cares about the vigilante's personal sense of right and wrong. And in the Moody's worldview, Gretchen Parker's life was worth nothing. She was collateral damage, a casualty of war in their crusade against sex offenders. Never mind that she had committed no crime. Never mind that she was simply a wife standing by her husband who had already served his sentence and paid his debt to society according to the law. In the Moody's eyes, her presence in that house on that day signed her death warrant. The couple had been loosely affiliated with an online white supremacist group called Crew 41, an organization with a documented history of targeting sex offenders. But investigators found no evidence that the murders had been directed or orchestrated by the group. This wasn't some coordinated operation by a larger extremist network. This was Jeremy and Christine Moody acting on their own twisted sense of righteousness, their own belief that they had been chosen by God, by fate, by some higher purpose, to carry out these killings. They were white supremacists, yes. Jeremy's body was a canvas of hate, with those tattoos proclaiming his racist ideology for all the world to see. But this particular crime wasn't primarily about race. It was about sex offenders. It was about a couple who believed they had the moral authority to decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die. When Jeremy and Christine Moody appeared in Bond court shortly after their arrest, they made no effort to hide who they were or what they believed. Christine referred to Charles Parker as a demon, her voice dripping with contempt and disgust. The couple openly boasted about their supremacist ties, their connection to extremist ideologies, their absolute conviction that what they had done was righteous and just. They were charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of possession of a firearm during a violent crime, first-degree burglary, and criminal conspiracy. The charges were serious, life-ending serious, but the Moody's didn't seem to care. If anything, they seemed energized by the attention, by the opportunity to proclaim their beliefs from a public platform. Prosecutors, when led by 16th Circuit Solicitor Kevin Brackett, emphasized a simple but crucial point. The Moody's had no legal authority to act as judge and jury. Charles Parker had committed a crime, yes. He had been convicted of sexually assaulting a disabled woman, and that crime was heinous and unforgivable. But he had also served his sentence. He had paid his debt to society according to the law. The justice system had run its course. Whatever anyone thought about whether that sentence was sufficient, whether justice had truly been served, none of that gave Jeremy and Christine Moody the right to break into his home and execute him and his wife. That's not how civilized society works. That's not justice. That's murder. As the case moved towards sentencing, the Moody's defense attorneys, Harry Dest for Jeremy and Marchetti Chiarenza for Christine, prepared to make their case for the minimum sentences of 30 years. They presented extensive evidence of their clients' severe mental health issues and traumatic backgrounds. For Jeremy, psychologist Harold Morgan testified about the schizophrenia and bipolar disorder that had left him suffering from delusions of grandiosity, convinced that he was on a divine mission from God. Jeremy had a history of family sexual abuse that had scarred him deeply. He had been off his medications at the time of the murders, his mind unmoored from reality, lost in a messianic fantasy where he was the hero of his own holy war. For Christine, the defense presented evidence of borderline personality disorder and a childhood so traumatic it's almost impossible to comprehend. On top of all that, Christine was a breast cancer survivor who had undergone a double mastectomy just 4 years before the murders, and she was disabled from injuries sustained in a car accident. Letters from her church and her mother-in-law portrayed her as a loving wife and devoted mother, despite her own battles with cancer and disability. The picture that emerged was of 2 deeply damaged people whose lives had been shaped by trauma and mental illness, whose capacity for empathy and moral reasoning had been warped by experiences that would break most people. When it came time for the defendants to address the court, they put on a performance that might have been convincing if anyone didn't know what was coming next. Jeremy spoke first, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine remorse.
Not a day goes by that I don't regret the incident that happened. And I know that what I've done is a sin.
Christine followed, reading verses from Psalm 69, verses 1 through 20, expressing sorrow for breaking the commandment against murder. She talked about their relationship, describing it as a fairy tale love like nothing anyone has experienced, and she begged the judge to give her the same sentence as Jeremy so they could grow old together and eventually see their children again. It was a master class in manipulation, in saying all the right things, in performing remorse for the court. But Judge Levive Alfred III wasn't buying it. He had been watching the Moody's throughout the hearing, watching them smile at each other, giggle together, exchange longing looks even as the families of their victims delivered heartbreaking impact statements about their loss. When one of those family members asked the standard plea question about whether any promises had been made to induce their guilty pleas, Christine couldn't resist a dark joke. "Just fame and fortune," she quipped, as if this were all some kind of game. Judge Alford saw through the performance. He noted their insincere remorse, their smiles during the victim impact statements, the high risk that they would reoffend if ever given the opportunity. "I saw you smiling at each other in court," he said, his voice heavy with disapproval. He expressed his concern that if they were ever released, they'd kill even more innocent people. And with that, he rejected the defense's request for minimum sentences and instead handed down 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for each defendant. Effectively, 3 life sentences when accounting for the stacked charges. They would serve those sentences in separate facilities, never to see each other again in freedom. The moment the sentence was pronounced, Jeremy and Christine shared that long, passionate kiss, a final defiant gesture of their fairy tale love, before being torn apart forever. And then came the moment that revealed who they really were, stripped of all pretense and performance. As they were escorted from the courtroom, the mask fell away completely, and the world saw the true face of Jeremy and Christine Moody, unrepentant, defiant, and absolutely convinced of their own righteousness.
Child molesters do not deserve to live. They got exactly what they deserve. Had to do it over again, I'd kill more.
What about what you said in court about repenting? Is that not true then?
No, it's not true. My lawyer made me say it.
Do you have anything to say to the victim's family?
May they die also.
These weren't the words of people who had been swept up in a moment of passion, who had made a terrible mistake in the heat of anger. These were the words of true believers, of people who had appointed themselves as instruments of divine justice and felt no shame, no regret, no recognition of the humanity they had stolen from 2 people and from the families who loved them.